I've been asking people online through Twitter and through my blog for the questions they would put to you.
Oh, that's interesting.
Some of them I don't know the entire background of, so if they end up more offensive than I think they are, then I apologise for that.
That's quite all right.
But I've got a few of my own, and so if you don't mind, I'm going to kick off with a few of my own, and then we'll get to the guys in the meantime.
Great.
One thing I think Here Comes Everybody does is popularises group forming network theory.
Yes.
I think you're a big fan of David Reed and Speed's Law, exponential growth of social networks, etc. But I think what you've achieved is to do it with a very human message. It makes the human element very important. So I just wondered whether there's any episodes or pieces of work that have changed your thinking along that journey, or what's in your personal makeup that's driven this belief in human beings?
I don't know, sort of short of a gene scan that found sort of pro-social or anti-social genes. I can't exactly say what's in my social makeup, but I will tell you a funny story, funny to me anyway, that sort of put me onto this early on. I started using the internet in 1993, and I joined a service called Panix. It was a public access internet service. And I fell in with a bunch of cranky Unix system administrators who worked at banks. Right? These were people who knew more about Unix, the operating system, than I will. They've forgotten more than I will ever know. And for some reason, they took me under their wing. And I would come in and ask stupid questions, and they would answer me. And then I would ask less stupid questions, and they would answer me in some more detail. And over the course of a couple of years, I got this incredible education. And then I started talking to people outside of this little domain about the internet, and people would say, "Did you do this in college?" And I'd say, "No, I didn't do this in college." And then they would say, "Oh, so you're self-taught?" It's like, well, also no. Those were people's two modes. Either there was an official institution or you did it on your own. It's like, no, actually there's this third thing, like, I got a really hardcore education. I just got it from people who did it because they liked it. And it suddenly seemed really strange to me how that collection of non-financial motivations nevertheless created something that was really valuable and hard to get elsewhere. And that little tickle from almost 20 years ago has kind of run through everything, which is, why do people do things outside of the official explanations of I do it because it's my job? Mm-hmm. And a large and growing amount of human participation is mediated by motivation as opposed to pay. The internet, mobile phones, applications built on top of them allow us to do things for one another without money changing hands. And that's a thing that I've been focused on really from the first month that I was online.
Okay, so that's interesting from the point of view of, well, maybe that moves us gently into the credit crunch stuff, actually. Because,
right.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, the banks are these huge blocks in the way the complex adaptive system of the economy can function,
right. And
perhaps their removal might actually end up with freer markets.
Yeah.
And group forming network theory, the internet, is a great demonstration that wherever there are blockages, wherever there are controls, people find their way around. So can you see, is there any long-term impact about the credit crunch? Do you think perhaps we might end up, we were talking earlier about Kiva and Prosper, do you think that might be a model more and more people end up going towards and actually doing their banking as communities of purpose, people sharing the same?
Yeah, no, I do think that that's a big potential shift here. Now, I should say, first of all, I'm not a professional financier, and so my view of it is very much as an interested amateur. And second of all, that what the governments of the world, and particularly Brussels, London, Washington, do is, I think, still very much up in the air. But I do think, whatever happens, that the model of saying the social capital within a community is actually a way to reduce risk and to offer loans that have a high chance of being paid back. Right? Yunus pioneered it with, it's the Grameen Phone, Grameen Bank model, where when you loan to a community, that community both exerts peer pressure on the recipient of the loan, but also helps spread the value of the loan into the community,
and that's being disconnected in current banking,
and can provide a cushion. And the current banking made, I think, several mistakes, right? Moving away from a sort of know your customer model to these so-called liar's loans, where you were not required to attest to anything. Exactly. No income, no job or assets loans, ninja loans, these things. And where the business of vetting whether or not you were going to be paid back moved away from a model based on trust to a model based on risk analysis. My view is that the people who should be run into the street and hunted down are Moody's, Fitch, the people who provided the AAA ratings, based entirely on a mathematical analysis that didn't take into account who was actually getting the loans. You move all the way to the other end of the scale, the microcredit model, as exemplified by Kiva reaching into the third world, and in the States right now, by a company called Prosper that's actually doing peer-to-peer lending within industrialized communities. It's the opposite. People not only know the customer, they know the customer's social network, they know the social network of the person getting the loan, and they know the social network of the people syndicating the loan. Right. So it's a return to the names, the Lloyds of London model. Yeah. And it turns out to be relatively higher cost than, just running some mathematical figures and dealing with risk management. But it is less subject to systemic breakdown. And I believe we're going to see an increase in that in the credit markets, because evidence of the current systemic breakdown is going to make people shy away from going right back to the mathematical modeling without a kind of without knowing your customer.
Okay, that's interesting that you think of taking the maths, the algorithms out of it, if you like, and getting a bit more of the human influence into all of our models.
The problem with the algorithms do a very bad job at detecting change that's caused by the operation of the algorithm. In the same way that we get a search engine optimization industry once we get search engine algorithms, we get a loan optimization industry once it becomes mathematically predictable what you need to do to get a loan, and a bunch of bad actors, really on both sides of the equation, the people writing loans and the people receiving the loans, will try and get just inside that loan. And so what all of the predictive models said was, let's assume the future is like the past, and now we'll run these predictive algorithms to slice up debt into these various tranches. But of course, because of the predictive algorithms, because of the slicing up of the debt, the future was not like the past. And so when you get these kind of feedback loops, the idea that there is some actor external to the system just looking down from the Olympian heights and merely measuring is utterly false. Right? What they're doing by measuring and slicing and dicing is to change the thing they're being measured, and they didn't take that into account. Now, I'm not anti-math, anti-algorithm, but I do believe that one of the counterweights to purely predictive modeling is to take into account social capital as a way of lowering the risk of default. And that's something that has been left completely by the wayside in the industrialization of finance, but has been picked up by the microcredit, microloan movement as something that's actually turned out to be quite effective.
Cool. I'm going to change the subject just a little bit, but probably building on what we've been talking about. The whole idea of group form and network theory, the idea that its exponential value is a potential at the moment but could become a reality if people could connect beyond silos, raises questions for me about how we get beyond the current silos we're using. What social tools, technologies, or social media do you think currently do the most effective job of group forming?
Oh, email, easily. I mean, the interesting thing is that this stuff doesn't get socially interesting until it gets technologically boring. It's not just enough to have a new tool. A lot of other people have to have the tool for it to have a really large-scale social effect. And it's not enough for those people to have the tool. They actually have to be bored by it. Right? They have to take it for granted. It can't just be, oh, I got an email, right? I mean, it's got to be, right? And so in the United States right now, the presidential election is on. You may have read a little something about it in the papers. John McCain and Barack Obama, the two main party candidates, and since the conventions for respectively Democratic and Republican Party, the most active political medium has been these email forwarding messages, where suddenly people are kicking into action to either reaffirm to their friends or to sway the votes of their friends and relatives. And email forwarding it's effortless, both because it works so well, but also because nobody has to think twice about it. Right? If you introduce somebody to Twitter, the sort of character limited messaging service, it's strange. It takes a little getting used to. Like it takes a while to get bored enough of Twitter to use it natively. Email, on the other hand, to a first approximation, everybody who's online has email, and so the really big social shifts right now come from not just from people putting up videos, putting up campaign ads, but from then people forwarding that around to their friends. Sarah Silverman, who's a famously foul-mouthed young comic in the States, has done a video exhorting young Jews to go to Florida and to extol the virtues of Barack Obama to their elderly parents and grandparents. And it's a very funny video. Of course, it's quite well done. She's very funny. But the mechanism by which that video has been carried around is through the lanes of the Jewish diaspora. Right? I talked to someone who'd gotten it forwarded to them from Israel. Right, and so the first they knew of it came from someplace completely outside the U.S., but deeply concerned with U.S. politics. And those social channels are a really big deal. And so some of the tools today will grow to be a big deal, right? Wikis, right? Everybody sort of tuned into wikis in about 2004 because of Wikipedia. They were almost 10 years old by that point. They were 9 years old. So it takes a long time for a shiny new tool to get both widespread and dull. And at that point, that's when the real social interaction starts to get quite interesting.
Okay, in that world where it's essentially you get to a ubiquitous community, anyone can connect with anyone else, presumably around things that they're passionate or share a purpose for. In that world, when the full disruption takes place, is there a place for anything mass? Is there a place for anything lowest common denominator?
Sure. The change here isn't we previously had only mass culture and now we're going to have no mass culture at all. The change is that there will be many fewer things that everybody does and many more things that only some people do. But there will always be mass events for two reasons. One, there will just, whatever year it is, there will be something that the most people are interested in that year, right? Every fourth year, that thing seems to be the Olympics, but there are other kinds of things. The World Cup plainly has some of these same convening effects. And secondly, there is an economic good called solidarity goods, which is to say something that grows in value when other people do it as well. So it's not just enough for me to watch The Office. It's much better for me if you also watch The Office, and then we can talk about how much our office is like that office. And so solidarity goods don't go away. They're a permanent class of economic good. What is happening is that you don't get to create solidarity goods out of scarcity. Right? The old media model said, well, there's only a couple of TV channels, right? The world we grew up in, right? You got about half the viewership, third of the viewership, just for showing up. And so everything, in a way, was a solidarity good, whether it was actually a really well thought out piece of documentary film or a sporting event or just a lousy sitcom, it got about a third of the audience. Now, for something to be a solidarity good, it actually has to interest the people tuning in. You don't just get it for free from scarcity. Yeah. And that I think is the big change in the media environment. Not that there's not things that are mass, but that the things that are mass, in a way, deserve to be mass or have earned the right to be mass, rather than just getting it because nothing else is on.
Well, maybe we'll come back to that with one of the guys' questions here about gin and television.
Oh, yes.
And we'll come back to that. Okay, well, I want to move on to some of the questions that people have sent in for
Great.
us. First one I got was from Jonathan McDonald. He's at Ogilvy 1.
Uh-huh.
He asked, what are the critical parts the media industry must change to enable increased interactivity and collaboration between brands and citizens?
Well, at least one of the things is not to... There's a doctrine in Anglo-American law that grants fictional personhood to companies, so that although it's funny in the UK you use the plural when talking about companies, which I always liked. But in any case, brands don't interact. Brands are inert. People interact, and so at least one of the things you have to change is to say, what does it mean to interact with a brand in human terms, right? In some cases it means talking with a live human being who works there. In other cases it means talking to people who care about that thing, right? The way people interact with Doctor Who is to talk to each other about how much they like the show. And I think one of the biggest changes in that required in that industry is to assume that in the interactive environment, there are qualities to interaction, not just quality, full stop, on one spectrum. Right? The advertising industry in particular has said there is one kind of quality, and it is production values. And so everything has to look perfect. We have to have a special photo shoot where we go to Corfu and we spend 2 days, taking these photos and so forth. Over and over again, what we see in interactive environments is that if something looks too good, people won't touch it. Right? You could do this in your own kitchen, right? If you go and you spend half a day arranging every single thing, or everything laid out just so it looks like it's ready for a magazine photo shoot, and then you send somebody into your kitchen, they will not pick up a knife. They will not help you cook. They will not touch anything. Because the perfection of the kitchen says, you don't belong here, right? On the other hand, if your kitchen looks like my kitchen looks like on the average day, like, oh, this is, the recently washed dishes have not yet been put away, and there's some stuff around, and, when a guest comes in, they'll feel right at home opening up the refrigerator, helping you cut them. The messiness, the openness, the kind of human characteristic tells people it's okay to interact. And the marketing business has been so focused on, we only get one shot at handing you a glossy photo or a 15-second ad, that we're going to do everything we can to clean it up right to the edges. But something that's been cleaned up right to the edges has no space for me in it. And having things that are rough enough to say, oh, you know what, we actually haven't thought through all of this. You could come in too if you wanted. That kind of invitation is something the industry isn't good at yet, but I think has to get good at.
That takes us on actually to the next question I had from Rebecca Carew, which was about education. Because I went to see some students in Birmingham, and it seemed to me that all students currently, even today's generation, switch off from the internet and disconnect when they have to get something done. When they have to finish something. Right. And I thought about it. You kill the idea stone dead, stuff it and put it on the wall. That's when you end the big collaboration. So there's a lot of interest in how education can access collaboration. And Rebecca's question is, do you have a view on how collaboration can be integrated into teaching in schools, and how to examine and score it?
That second question is the hardest question. And no, I don't. Like I don't have. I wish I did. I don't have the prescription. But there's this story. Chris Avenir from Ryerson College. Did you see this thing? This a freshman at Ryerson University. Freshman at Ryerson University in Canada. Started his own Facebook study group for his chemistry class. Okay. And he got 146 of his fellow students to join. So they're going along studying chemistry, and suddenly he's called up on charges, 147 counts. And the university is going to expel him. Because universities have two different messages. One message on the inside is, welcome to the community of scholars, we're glad you're here, we advance the conversation in groups. The best kind of class to be in is a small discussion seminar. And then to the outside world, they say, we do quality control of individual minds, we stuff brains with facts and stamp a diploma on them and ship them to you. And those two systems are in such profound tension that the only thing that kept the two messages from bumping into each other was the group message stayed entirely within the walls of the college, and the diploma message was entirely for external consumption. And now we're dealing with collision. And I say this as a person who teaches at a university where there is a great emphasis on collaborative work. At the Interactive Telecommunications program where I teach at NYU, all students spend some of their time working on group efforts. The only thing we've been able to do is to keep the groups small so that they become self-policing. So you don't get free riders, you don't get one student just coming along for the ride. But it is such a deep and profound shift from each student must learn roughly the same things in the class to when you put a group together, people sort out what their interests and specialties are. That it seems to me to presage some fairly serious redesign. And the best we've got right now are essentially special cases. So is it trying group effort and working out a bit at a time how to reward it is going to be the work of a generation. I don't think that there's any simple set of rules that takes us from A to B, particularly in the academy.
It's one of the things we're going to have to work out post-TV.
Yeah. In fact, what we should be doing is, I wouldn't say post-TV, I'd say next to TV. We'll get to that question, I can tell. But one of the things we should be doing is really everybody who's experimenting with group work inside the academy should be sharing their examples, both what works and what doesn't work.
Is he saying inside and outside?
I mean, by outside, I mean in K through 12 education as well, and education for younger children. Right. So there's one set of problems at the collegiate and graduate level, and then there's another set of problems, particularly I think for high school students, not so much for K through 8, but for high school students who are entering into the social arena in an adult way for the first time. Creating an environment in which they're both expected to and rewarded for working together would be good for society, among other things. But it's such a profound shift that I think the best we can do right now is to have everybody thinking about this, essentially talking about the bit they know, whether it's something that works especially well or something that's especially disastrous, and over time just integrate integrate the idea of how schools should run based on what we learn.
That's going to be a really tough one.
That institution especially is challenged by.
And it's just one of the many areas that the disruption that the whole group forming thing is going to bring. We won't have time to deal with it all today. I get onto another couple of questions. I've got one from Matt Edgar, who I believe works for Orange.
Okay.
And he asked, why call the book Here Comes Everybody? Haven't self-organising and communicating been characteristics of human society for thousands of years? So his question is really, is technology really changing people's behaviour or simply making existing behaviour more visible online?
Well, there's a famous philosophical distinction between difference in degree and difference in kind. And so the question is something is it just more of X, or is it really a new thing? When that distinction runs into systems thinking, it breaks down, because I think it may have been Joel Spolsky who said this. He said, when you make something work 10 times better, you haven't improved the old thing, you've created a new thing. And so certainly the book is in fact, it starts with the premise that humans are natively and deeply social. That these tools are ways of expressing that bit of human nature. On the other hand, the characteristics of the expression are unprecedented, right? I mean, when you look at the number of people who work on Wikipedia, who work on the Linux operating system, we're now dealing with collaborative groups that are larger than the largest hierarchical organization that has ever existed. And in the book, I essentially make a claim for novelty of scale, even given humans' native social abilities. It's the combination of those abilities and an environment that rewards them and shapes them in ways that we've never seen that are creating the novelty. So I'm not claiming, and in fact in the first chapter disavow the kind of techno-determinism that says essentially these tools are making people do things.
Sure.
People are doing them because we like them, because we like to work with each other. But there is a really profound difference between being able to find, being limited to my geographic area in finding people who share my interests, to being limited only by the density of communications around the entire globe.
So I guess one of the silos we have to solve in that context is language.
Right. I mean, there's a bunch of interesting work on crowdsourcing translation. First asynchronous translation, later simultaneous translation. The geeks, as always, they're ahead of the rest of us, because the language of code and the kind of discussions around code have centered. First, source code is its own language, and then English has become the kind of lingua franca. You get this very curious phenomenon, which is small global organizations. We're used to thinking of, you have a company, and then you can have a regional company, and then a national company, and then global company is the biggest kind, right? Linux, the day Linus talked about doing this, he got answers from all around the world. He got answers from Austria, from New Zealand, from California. So he started with a 5-person global operation.
Yeah.
And that desilization, if you want to coin an awful phrase, started because the language barrier didn't exist in the technical community. Figuring out how to get people to communicate across language barriers in all kinds of other endeavors is really a big future challenge.
Cool. So I'm going to ask you one from Simon Collister. I'm not really sure the background on this.
All right.
I'll ask it and see what happens.
Very
So
good.
why doesn't Here Comes Everybody tackle the battle over copyright and DRM? And he asks, is it, as Felix Strader claimed, a case of self-censorship? Perhaps it's too controversial.
Oh yes, I love that Felix thing.
you know about this stuff?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Do you want to tackle it?
Sure. So Felix writes this thing in which he says, essentially, the author did not agree with me, and the only possible explanation for that is that he secretly agrees with me, but he's tamping it down.
Right.
In fact, there's a much more parsimonious explanation, which is that I think Felix is wrong.
Yeah.
Felix's view seems to me, from reading that piece, that copyright and DRM is the core battle of the age, and that
and we just worked around it.
It is well. So this is my view, which is essentially one of the misunderstandings actually. So I think there's actually two different pieces. Felix has, I think, misunderstood something about the book, and then he and I disagree. The misunderstanding is that this is a book about the current change loosely going under the phrase Web 2.0, right? Which is a phrase I never use in the book. I actually don't find it that helpful. But it's not. It's a book about change in the social environment. And so where we disagree is Felix believes that the change in the social environment is almost completely bound up in conversations about copyright and DRM, and I don't. I think, in fact, that the huge shift here, which I talk about fairly extensively in the chapter on open source, is around the novel copyright bargain offered up by the GPL, by the license used for open source software, and by kind of related licenses like the Creative Commons license. So in fact, I think copyright and DRM, while it's a major problem in some economic models of the media industry as a sort of broadcast-centric industry, actually doesn't affect sociality that much. And the routing around function that you alluded to with copyright law is to use these permissive licenses that essentially guarantee reuse by good actors. Mm-hmm. So in fact, I've written plenty on copyright on DRM. There's no self-censorship, and no one's ever accused me of self-censorship before. I tend to go on at length about anything I'm interested in, but I didn't put copyright on DRM here because I don't think it matters that much. Not just that, but I don't think it is part of the story, but it's a very minor part of the story. It's not actually it's not the part that matters very much. The question of whether or not we're going to stick it to the man vis-a-vis the big media companies is actually much less interesting than the question of under what circumstances is massive collaboration a good idea. And that's really not bound up with the DRM fight at all.
Okay. Nicely dealt with. I want to get on to the gin.
Oh yes, me too.
This
It's only one in the afternoon, but why not?
This is a question from Tim Holmes, and for those who aren't aware, I'm sure a quick bit of Googling will explain that Clay wrote about a heat sink.
Heat sink, yes.
And the idea was that as the UK industrialised, we couldn't cope with the shift from country life to urban life, and the way we dealt with it was to get very drunk for a long time. And only when we stopped being drunk did we start building these great institutions, the education systems, the health services. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but your explanation of television is that certainly for the last sort of 40, 50 years, that's been our version of gin, as we've shifted again into a new, the information age, I guess. And it's been our way of coping with...
yes. Now, one asterisk on that is it's not so much the fact of gin and the fact of television, it's the fact of the gin craze. The hard thing to explain is not why people drink gin. It's quite tasty. The hard thing to explain is why in the early 1700s gin consumption went through the roof. And it went through the roof mainly in London, which was the city that was whose population density was expanding most dramatically. It wasn't a rural phenomenon, and it was only a minor phenomenon in the industrial centers of the Midlands. It was really where the population density was growing. And in a way, and the same thing is true of television. The hard thing to explain is not why people watch television. There's some funny stuff on, there's some interesting stuff on, why not? It's why did it become a half-time job for every citizen of the industrialized world? Why is it 20 hours a week for everyone, to a first approximation in industrialized nations? And so it's the gin craze and the 20 hours a week of television watching that needs explaining, not gin itself and television itself. Yeah. I'm sorry, and so the question was?
The question was, what's next in the sequence? Gin, TV, then what?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know, because in fact there are long periods in which there is none of that kind of dissipation. What I think, what was next in the sequence, interestingly, about the gin craze, is that there were 30 years in which Parliament essentially tried to put the cork back in the bottle, both literally and figuratively. They said, they passed all of these laws essentially trying to replicate the morals and behaviors of pre-industrial society. In particular, people were scandalized that women were drinking gin, right? And this, no good could come of this, as you can imagine the thought at the time. And it was really only 30 years later, in the 1750s, when there was a kind of capitulation on all sides, that there was not going to be any way to preserve the pre-industrial environment of London, that in fact civic institutions were going to have to be developed that dealt with the fact that there were all of these people living cheek by jowl in what had been, certainly not a sleepy little town, but what had been a fraction of its size by 1750. There is a similar sense among, there's a group of kind of on the scale, sort of pessimist to Luddite writers. Nick Carr is the only one of that group actually worth paying attention to, but there's a bunch of them: Gorman, Keane, Bierkerts, Lee Siegel, all of whom have the same rough attitude, which is, I'm not against digital technology per se. I just think we should acquire only as much of it as won't change society. And that seems to me to be almost exactly the attitude of Parliament in the 1720s, which is, we want to regulate this to the point that it doesn't change anything. What we'd really like to do is hold on to what we're familiar with and take only sort of little advantageous slices of the new. And it seems to me that what's at the end, not of television itself, but at the end of, I'm going to watch television 20 hours a week, is participatory media that rewards not just consumption but also production and sharing. And what we're entering into now, I mean, again, now in the sense of a historical generation, is a massive period of experimentation with what kinds of amateur production and what kinds of global sharing actually work well. because we're leaving the environment where human contact was largely limited to family and business, and we're entering a world where at least the potential is human contact is limited mainly by the choice of the avenues along which you look for people to talk to about what interests you, about what you care about, and so forth.
Okay. I think that how long have we got?
35 minutes.
Oh, well, I'm already over time, so we'll draw that to a
very good.
conclusion. So
All right.
thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great.